Throughout the series, we've seen Capcom respond to the early works of the beat-em-up genre, put their own style on it, and experiment with different gameplay systems to create more dynamic action games. We've discussed the focus on visual design and presentation in these games, and covered the first attempts at using licensed properties. Today we're going to be covering 3 licensed beat-em-ups from Capcom, all adapted from comic book series. We'll see the first of Capcom's work with Marvel comic characters, as well as a stylish interpretation of the independent comic Xenozoic Tales. But first of all, we've got to cover Warriors of Fate. This title made its way to arcades on Halloween of '92, over a year after Capcom's previous belt-scroller Captain Commando. As a sequel to Dynasty Wars, which I covered in the first video of this series, the game adapts the manga Tenchi wo Kurao and carries the comic's name in Japan. However, this series wasn't limited to beat-em-ups or even to the arcades. Capcom also released 2 games for the Famicom under the name, with the first one localized for Northern America as Destiny of an Emperor. If you watched the first video, you might remember that Tenchi wo Kurao, the manga, is actually an adaptation itself. The story follows the general plot of the Chinese epic Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The story has been adapted a ton of times. A lot of game enjoyers will know the characters and events from Koei Tecmo's Dynasty Warriors series, but the history of interactive imaginings of this Han Dynasty epic goes back to before the release of Dynasty Wars in 1989. Founded in the late 1970s, Koei stumbled into strategy games by way of productivity software and 8-bit smut during Japan's electronics bubble. In spite of these humble beginnings, they made a name for themselves with Nobunaga's Ambition in '83 and then Romance of the Three Kingdoms in '85, 2 warring state simulators that established long-term series for the company. These games are pretty bog-standard strategy titles, capturing provinces, trying to hold control of as much of the map as possible, managing resources and units, that sort of stuff. While I consider myself somewhat versed in strategy games, I've never played one from this era without some kind of headache. We'd expect a Tenchi wo Kurao strategy game to be a lot like Koei's long-running series then, right? Wrong. This shit plays like Shin Megami Tensei with legendary Chinese generals instead of demons. There are over 150 different one of them, with different fixed stats that you can build a party with like their Pokemon. The overworld and menus reek of Dragon Quest, while the battle screen takes a Final Fantasy-like side view. It feels a lot like Capcom devs pulling things they liked from a bunch of different games, and while I might have been a bit hyperbolic in my comparisons, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Iteration is arguably more integral to games than any other type of medium, and I don't really believe in such things as originality. Everyone's got influences. I definitely want to check out some of these RPGs at some point in the future, and maybe I'll do another video on more Three Kingdoms adaptations soon. One of the reasons I wanted to do this retrospective specifically on Capcom titles was that from Final Fight's debut in 1989 to the release of the final game on our list in '97, the company churned out roughly 13 to 15 beat-em-ups, depending on how you define the genre. At the beginning of the project, I nearly excluded Dynasty Wars from the list. I kept saying, if I include the horse beat-em-up, I have to include games like Avenger, Capcom's 1987 top-down brawler that plays a lot like Capcom's other vertically scrolling game Commando, or Tiger Road, which bears a strong resemblance to other arcade action game contemporaries, such as Tecmo's Rygar. All of these games could reasonably be called beat-em-ups, but I chose not to include them for 2 reasons. First of all of these games that we have covered past 1989 have had the skeleton of Final Fight within them, and Dynasty Wars just managed to be ahead of its time enough to be notable. Beat-em-ups should play, at least for the sake of this retrospective, like single-player fighting games. Second is that there is a more connected developer lineage between the games I've identified as beat-em-ups. Commando, Tiger Road, Avenger all share a common designer, Tokuro Fujiwara. Fujiwara was already an industry veteran by the time the 2 Akiras were scrounging up design documents for what would become Final Fight, having worked for Konami before eventually landing at Capcom just in time for the company's first arcade game, Vulgus. He later went on to direct Ghost and Ghouls, Strider, and Bionic Commando, as well as working on the Mega Man and Breath of Fire series. In the arcade era, Fujiwara made platform action games, not single-player fighting games. I think that this does enough to distinguish beat-em-ups from other action games, but this won't be the last time you hear about Fujiwara from me. Speaking of design heritage, Warriors of Fate shares a director, one Noritaka Funamizu, with its prequel. Funamizu, who went by the moniker of Pooh in credits at the time, worked on many of Capcom's fighting games and had worked with the Akiras on multiple projects since Final Fight. In an interview soon after the launch but before the hit of Street Fighter II, Funamizu was described as being the reliever, the guy whose job was to fix shit after everyone else had done the groundwork. He talks about how he wishes he could have a hit game like Konami's Gradius, but the amount of work he had to put into tweaking and fixing other games made directing difficult for him. Another developer describes him as the type of guy to finish someone else's game rather than to start his own. That interview was in '91, and in the following few years, Funamizu directed quite a few games for Capcom, including 2 of the titles covered in this video. These games are Final Fight in their bones, but with a lot of tweaks and modifications to the formula. This is reminiscent of the multiple versions of Street Fighter II, and it shows Funamizu and other Capcom devs' skill at iteration. To put things in perspective, we've covered up to 3 years of Capcom beat-em-ups between Dynasty Wars and Warriors of Fate. From '89 to '92, Capcom produced 6 beat-em-ups, and that wasn't even the genre they were necessarily known for in arcades. The games we covered last time were just the start, and I think Warriors of Fate is when Capcom really started to have fun with these belt scrollers. This game feels faster than anything I've played for this retrospective so far, and more importantly, it brings the horse back. This time, instead of being perma-mounted upon your steed, the horse is arguably a power-up, much like it was in Knights of the Round. I had a hard time using it in combat, but it depends on what character you're playing as. There's a lot more differences between the 5 playable characters here than in the past titles. The characters are all famous generals from Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but in English they were given vaguely Mongolian names. Some of the bosses are renamed to Khan, and almost all of the names tied to the Chinese epic are altered in some way. I really like playing as Porter, or Guan Yu. He's kind of like a Mike Hagar with the big drop kick and having decent suplex attacks. I really like how he plays like a big brawler character without being the heftiest or slowest character on the roster. Each character has a dash that can be performed by hitting down and jump at the same time, as well as a contextual grab that can result in multiple different throw options. Pressing jump with a grabbed enemy will enact a jumping suplex move. Enemies can be thrown any direction with a flick of the stick, but most characters also have a neutral grabbing attack done by pressing the attack button. Kasser, or Zhang Fei, was another character I really enjoyed. This is a full year after Street Fighter II, mind you, and there are shades of Blanca in him. His neutral grab is very similar to Blanca's command grab, where he chomps down, and jab animations also feel vaguely Blanca-like to me. Zhao Yun, who is named Subutai in English, plays more like a character from Knights of the Round than the first 2, which resemble Final Fight more. The sword swings feel a bit chunkier, grabs aren't near as strong, and his suplex move is replaced by an aerial kick. He's my least favorite, but still not the least used character according to the cute little ranking at the end of the game. The character I used the least ended up being Wei Yan, who goes by the name Abaka in English. He fights with a sword as well and reminds me of the heavy character from Knights of the Round. I really did not like this character at first, as he's really slow, but I learned that his throws are actually really good, his hitboxes from the horse are probably the best out of all the characters, and his dash is fast for a heavy character. Finally, there's Kadan, or Huangzong, who is this old man with a bow and arrow. He's really interesting to play while riding the horse, because the game of chicken you end up having to play when you pick a projectile character in these sorts of games. Surprisingly, his close-up moveset is really strong too, with some of the fastest throws out of any character. The best part is his dash move, which is this pathetic little roll. The dash attacks are a nice mechanic, and it really helps to mix up your combos. It feels a lot like Dante's Stinger from Devil May Cry, a later Capcom title. It helps you understand how to move and attack while still keeping everything flowing. The collectibles in this game sadly don't tie to a progression system as they did in Dynasty Wars, but at least there's some weapons to pick up. There's Capcom classics like the throwing knife or these bombs thrown by enemies, but most of the other weapons are just overhead attacks. However, there are a few different properties between them. The hammer will leave enemies stunned, the swords will slice through smaller opponents, and the smaller blades will occasionally deflect attacks. While the enemy designs do tend to get repetitive, the battle animations are all really stylish, especially the throws. Sometimes enemies will get cut in half or jib into bits, and the bosses all have really impressive designs and animations. The final boss, Cao Cao, actually offers you something never seen before in a Capcom brawler, but something we'll start to become very familiar with soon. Warriors of Fate offers players a small but impactful branching choice at the end. You have 15 seconds to kill Cao Cao. If you don't, you get the bad ending, where he pulls a Sherlock and somehow survives the leap into the waterfall, eventually getting his revenge. If you beat him, however, Liu Bei unites the land. My knowledge on this story is limited, but I'm pretty sure that's not how things actually went, at least from what I know from playing Dynasty Warriors. Final Fight had an alternate ending for clearing the game on 1 credit, but as far as I know, this is the first of Capcom's brawlers to take that idea outside of the realm of Easter eggs and have it have actual narrative impact. Warriors of Fate was a step in the right direction for Capcom brawlers. Faster, flashier, and fleshed out mechanics all made for a more solid experience. There's not a lot of behind-the-scenes information on the game. It got ported to the Saturn and the PlayStation a few years down the line, but there's not that many notable differences between the versions. This will be the last time we talk about any Romance of the Three Kingdoms adaptations in this retrospective, but I definitely want to try to come back to the setting for future videos. Between the Koei strategy games, Dynasty Warriors, and Capcom's Famicom RPGs, there's a lot that I could cover.
America's #1 comic book thanks to you. So I started this company to make the toys that you asked for.
Spawn, Violator.
I hear the competition's flying around. They could be any place.
Starting in the late 80s, American comic books underwent a renaissance of sorts. Unlike other countries with robust comic industries, the United States had been on the heels of the Comics Code, which restricted the kinds of stories that mainstream comics could tell since the beginning of the 20th century. Marvel and DC started printing more adult-oriented comics under imprints, which was a common loophole around the code. But there still was a niche for gory, over-the-top comics that independent publishers could fill. Labels like Image and Mirage managed to sell their alternative heroes and darker storylines to an audience who wanted something big publishers couldn't offer. Characters like Spawn and the Ninja Turtles became franchises in their own rights in spite of their indie beginnings. The next 2 games we're covering are both adapted from comics that rose out of these conditions. Usually, I try to cover games in the order that they were released. However, arcade release dates can be a little hard to place, and I've seen February to April listed as release months for Cadillacs and Dinosaurs and Marvel's The Punisher. While I'm saving The Punisher for the next video, I'm including both of them here because they released so close to each other. They both share development staff, and they have a lot of general similarity. The background on these titles is rather limited, however. For one, the designers for Cadillacs and Dinosaurs are credited under the names Da, Tari, and JRA. I wasn't able to find any information about who these people could be, except for other people online who are just as stumped by it as I am. Another question I have is just how did Capcom get these licenses in the first place? There's not a lot of information on whether or not these publishers reached out to them, or if Capcom pitched these adaptations themselves. The Punisher is noted as being the beginning of a relationship between Capcom and Marvel that would later bloom into the currently defunct Versus fighting series. Capcom never made another licensed title for Kitchen Sink Press, the long-standing underground comic label that published Cadillacs and Dinosaurs as source material Xenozoic Tales. I reached out to Kitchen Sink's founder, Dennis Kitchen, and he told me that the arcade game was part of the merchandising agreement made when the comic was adapted into a Saturday morning cartoon for CBS. CBS ended up asking Capcom to make the arcade game as part of their merchandising projects for this fledgling franchise. Written and illustrated by Mark Schultz, Xenozoic Tales started publication in '86, running for 14 issues and ending a decade later in October of '96. The story features a post-apocalyptic wasteland where dinosaurs and humans roam together. Our main character is Jack Cadillac Henrik, who guides people through the apocalyptic wastes and often has to take justice into his own hands. He drives the eponymous Cadillac, although altered to run on dinosaur droppings due to the lack of oil in this future. He's joined by Hannah, an emissary from another tribe of wastelanders. Their whole gimmick is that he always gets himself into some sort of trouble, and she does something unexpected to save him that makes the audience ask, who's the real damsel in distress here? It's kind of corny. Characters all seem to look up to Jack and treat him as a de facto authority figure, as well as a surprising amount of environmentalism in the few issues I've read. Often, dino poachers make themselves apparent as the bad guy, or at least the cause of the problem in multiple issues. Jack is this sort of idealistic frontiersman who believes in participating in the cycle of nature and all that good stuff. It's not super heavy-handed, nor is it particularly radical, but it does feel like it's trying to say something. I enjoyed what I've read of it, and and I'll probably finish the series after writing this script. Comic books from this era can sometimes have some really stilted dialogue or some really janky art, but Xenozoic Tales has this pulp novel cover art style that really adds to the setting. It sets the series apart from the grim dark style that you can even see in ads tucked away at the back of some of these issues. I've never heard of most of these series before, mostly because comics had begun to just be saturated with works that relied on edge and hyperviolence, not for the sake of catharsis or even for shock value, but more so just to serve the vapid aesthetic interests of 90s adolescents. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the game, was released in early 1993. The show it was meant to tie into, of course, strayed further from the pulpy tone of the original comics. The change in name was required by Cadillac themselves in exchange for the use of their vehicles in the franchise. The series is animated by Canadian company Nelvana, who were responsible for many different children's cartoons since the 80s, including Captain Planet and the Care Bears. The animation is pretty solid, the characters are all really expressive when they talk, and the designs are strong even though they lack some of the style of the original comics. I really miss Hannah's cute assortment of different outfits, but there is just kind of a lot of unnecessary fan service in the comic anyway, and I know you gotta draw characters on model for animation. The design and tone for the arcade game is somewhere in the middle between the show and the source material. It doesn't fully evoke the pulpy schlock vibes that the comic does so well, but it still has some significant edge when you compare it to the cartoon. In terms of actual gameplay, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs continues to refine the Capcom approach to belt-scrolling action. Jack and Hannah make up 2 of the 4 playable characters, with the other 2 being side characters, Mustafa and Mess. Jack and Hannah are all-rounders, Mess is the heavy bruiser, and Mustafa is a fast character, almost kind of like Guy from Final Fight, but he's also got a drop kick that's typical of a heavy character like Mike Hagar. We're really starting to see Capcom play around with these archetypes that they created in Final Fight with the way characters are designed. Warriors of Fate reminded me a lot of King of Dragons, having this variance between the different characters. We'll see a return to that almost class-based approach soon. Fun fact, this game is actually known as Mustafa in many countries, especially those where an official market hadn't developed and bootleg cabinets were common. This game was, for some reason, more prevalent in these markets than many other Capcom games, making it an iconic title to those who frequented arcades in those countries. To learn more about this, read literally any comment section of a popular video regarding this game. Characters also have a special move that takes a little bit of health as per usual, and I've read that there are team attacks in this game, but I wasn't able to pull one off. The game starts with a rather bland start screen for Capcom standards. Usually these are rather flashy and show a lot of the game's character, but this one is just the logo on a flat green background. Capcom does give us a cute little character select screen though, so that makes it fine. The game starts you off in a locale that looks not too far off from the streets of Metro City. This is the City in the Sea, which is the half-submerged urban settlement that Jack calls home. As you start to fight off baddies, you'll definitely start to hear more clearer voice lines than we've ever heard from previous titles. The main characters all speak in English. I found nothing to confirm this, but it isn't too far off to say that these might be the voice actors from the cartoon. It's very possible that if CBS went to the trouble of getting a whole arcade game made for this show, that they would also use those same vocal artists, or at least clips taken from the show. It's just as likely that they're Capcom interns or the game's composers. There's no source either way. As is often the case in the source material, Jack and his crew are pitted against rogue poachers who seek to kill the dinosaurs for whatever their guts may be worth. This actually provides for an interesting new gameplay detail. Enemies can run up to these sleeping dinosaurs and awaken them, which causes them to go berserk. These dinosaurs will attack player and enemy alike, so players have an incentive to drop what they're doing in order to keep the dinos from being disturbed. This not only feels true to the source material, which would often depict dinosaurs as unflinching forces of nature that are separate from the conflicts of man, yet also still needed to be defended by man, but it is also one of the first examples of enemy infighting in games that I can think of. I've always heard that Doom was the first title to implement such a feature, but Doom released in December of 1993, months after Cadillacs and Dinosaurs cabinets started hitting arcades. Another notable thing about the dino enemies is how weird their names are. Triceratops are called Max and pterodactyls are called Zeeks. This is one of my favorite Capcom games, one of my favorite arcade games in general. Hell, half the reason I decided to start this retrospective in the first place was replaying Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. It's the game that I've played the most out of all of these, and I was always struck by how weird and casual the names for the dinosaurs were. I didn't know until I I started reading the comic books in preparation for this video that they actually come from the source material. Of course, the post-apocalypse of Xenozoic Tales contains little knowledge of human history, but lot knowledge about dinosaur, leading to their own names for the creatures. Bosses and enemies are also pulled from a lot of the single chapter villains of the comic, which is really cool to see that the source material wasn't lost in adaptation. The Terhunes get multiple enemies based around them. As we keep going through these games, we find a constant increase of pace. Now added are guns, which have their own different types and of course their own ammo pickups. When you come in with a new credit, you even get a rocket launcher and a volley of rockets. Hannah has bigger ranges for melee weapons, and characters can use a knife when they dash to cut enemies they run past. There are also a few new set pieces, bosses with multiple forms, that sort of thing, but the most important is the driving sequence. The first 2 levels lead the player out of the city and into the swamp. After that, they find themselves in the desert somehow. Picking up this little radio transceiver doohickey from the sandy dunes will summon Jack's Cadillac, which can be used to plow through the conveniently placed obstacles and enemies. It's actually possible to destroy the car in this sequence, or to avoid the doohickey altogether. These options just force you to play out the entire long-ass desert stage on foot, which takes so much time. While yes, you might be able to build a higher score that way, and you could call that missed content, it really kills the pacing of the game to have to fight wave after wave of enemy in the same repeating desert environment. The boss you have to fight is on a motorcycle and can be killed with the car, but more likely you're going to have to fight him on foot. Besides the obligatory boss who flash steps around and gives me a headache that has to be in every one of these games for some reason, this has to be the most annoying boss I've encountered in one of these games so far. It's just grenades flying around and he's just moving on and off of the screen. It's too much. It's too much. On the topic of pacing, it's hard to put into words how much faster of an experience this game is compared to any of the other titles I've played so far. I think it has a lot to do with the intertwined nature of beat-em-ups and fighting games, at least within Capcom at the time. 1993 was the year that Capcom introduced the new challengers to Street Fighter II, when the game was ported to the next generation of Capcom Play System boards. In December of the previous year, Capcom released an upgrade kit that arcade owners would be able to install as an add-on to their original Street Fighter II cabinets, likely to offer a mid-level upgrade to arcade owners who did not wish to fully upgrade to the CPS2. This Turbo Edition was Capcom's own response to bootleg add-ons that offered similar improvements to the game's speed and balance. Judging by approximate release dates, these add-ons and the games I've covered were probably developed alongside each other. The increased amount of special moves and the special inputs that come along with them is another example of how the design philosophies of beat-em-ups and fighting games were intertwined at Capcom. There are actually so many special moves for the characters in these games that were completely lost on me, either because I didn't look them up or because I couldn't execute them very well playing on my keyboard or with a controller. It's been a bit since I've touched on sound in one of these videos, but the composers of this game, Seiyun Nishigaki and Isao Abe, worked on quite a bit for Capcom. Abe composed for Knights of the Round, Nishikagi worked on Captain Commando. They worked together on many titles, including composing themes for all of Street Fighter's new challengers, as well as on Cadillacs and Dinosaurs and The Punisher. Abe worked on later entries in the Street Fighter series, while Nishikagi would go on to compose for the early entries of the Resident Evil series. The two of them have laid down some rather straightforward but still gnarly arcade prog tracks that really sort of helped to push the action along. I forgot to mention this in the last video, but Yoko Shimomura actually composed for The King of Dragons, alongside another game we'll be covering very soon. Shimomura was the main composer for Street Fighter II, although she might be best known as the composer for Square RPGs like Kingdom Hearts and Parasite Eve. Abe and Shimomura were also part of Alpha Lyla, Capcom's house band. Shimomura played piano and Abe played guitar. There are actually multiple albums with arranged tracks released, including songs from Final Fight, Captain Commando, Street Fighter, and even Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. Just listen to this arrangement of a track from Punisher. Some credit has to be given as well to Capcom's arcade sound systems. Some of you might remember these old Q-Sound logos in classic Capcom games. Q-Sound is a music filtering algorithm that was used by tons of game designers and many professional sound engineers of the time too. The algorithm helps to pull the best sound out of the tiny speakers that usually were found on arcade cabinets. Warriors of Fate, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and The Punisher are all three grouped together because they ran off the CP System Dash, a modified version of the original CPS board with dedicated sound memory and the Q-Sound filtering. The difference in sample quality between this and the previous games I've covered is staggering. Warriors of Fate has this epic, booming, orchestral score, while Cadillacs and Punisher has this more traditional action arcade game soundtrack. While this dedicated audio memory may have allowed for different genres and textures, there still was a kind of frenetic, driving, club-like music associated with arcade titles at the time, especially brawlers. Another important name for the music department is Toshio Kojima, who went by the moniker of Bull. Bull adapted the music for Final Fight to the Super Nintendo, and worked alongside many of the other composers mentioned on games like Warriors of Fate, Super Street Fighter II, and Resident Evil 2. However, he is often listed as being part of sound design or as a sound designer more than he is credited as a composer. The fact that this is true even for his current work tells me that Bull was likely more involved in creating the soundscapes of these games as opposed to their scores. Following the big driving sequence, the crew heads back to Jack's garage, which is under attack from the poachers. I love the dynamic stage maps that are usually shown at the beginning of levels in Capcom beat-em-ups. It really helps sell a sense of place to Metro City in the original Final Fight, and it's still effective half a decade later in Cadillacs. There's just so much style baked into the background of every single one of these Capcom beat-em-ups. I love how enemies will smoke a cigarette while they wait for you to come into their aggro range, a little detail that we haven't really seen since Captain Commando. After they run the poachers out of the garage, the crew follows them to a town that they're burning down, and eventually into their jungle base / mine / secret laboratory. In the jungle stage, you'll encounter dinosaur legs that are traipsing around, toppling over enemies as well as the player. It's not hard to avoid these limbs, but it is an extra little layer that adds some character to what would otherwise be a simple forest level. As you start getting closer and closer to the end, you start to see these creatures. These are the half-man, half-dino creations of Dr. Simon Fessenden. Fessenden, the game's ultimate big baddie. He puts you through 2 dinky boss phases before turning into the dinosaur version of the chest baby guy from Total Recall. After you kick his ass, the whole facility starts to fall apart, and the crew has to sprint out of there before they die. The game ends with Mustafa and Mess walking off, assuming because they left Jack and Hannah back there that they didn't make it out alive. Once the credits finish rolling, the 2 main characters pull up in another dino shit propelled convertible. Where'd that one come from? Which they all drive off in together. This hard cut straight to the credits absolutely killed me the first time I played this. I genuinely thought they were dead. I love this game. I love Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. Like I said, it was one of the first games like this that I played. It was one of the first games that really made me want to make this sort of retrospective, but that was a lot to cover in just one video. I really wanted to get around to The Punisher, but it was just too much to cram in. I'm writing so much and I'm thinking big picture because I want this retrospective to feel connected to itself, connected together. I want all of these videos to feel connected together. It would have been nice to have all the System Dash games together, but I think it's probably for the best to keep Punisher to its own video. However, I am going to use this opportunity to do a full retrospective on the Punisher video games. There are surprisingly more titles that use Marvel's edgy anti-hero than one might believe. I know it's been a bit since my last video, and honestly, there's no way this one isn't coming out a little rushed. I really just want to write about things I enjoy, so if you're interested in reading more of my work, I'm going to include a link to my personal blog below where you can find all sorts of writing of my own. There's a lot of different video ideas floating around in my head, and hopefully I'll get to all of them. I just want to say thank you to anyone who has ever bothered to watch one of my videos. It honestly means so much to me that you would spend your time with my work. Join me next time to see if I can pull off a mini Punisher retrospective within my regular Capcom retrospective. Stay tuned, folks.